I'm standing in the back of St. Mary's Cathedral, watching my mother walk down the aisle in her pristine white dress, her face glowing with that perfect smile she's perfected over the years. The same smile she wore when she told my fiancé that I had cheated on him 3 days before our wedding. The same smile she wore when she accidentally spilled red wine on my grandmother's vintage wedding dress. The same smile she wore when she convinced half our guest list that the wedding was postponed due to my emotional instability. But today, that smile is about to disappear forever because I'm about to give her the wedding gift she truly deserves. My hands are trembling as I clutch the manila envelope containing 15 years of her lies, manipulations, and betrayals. Every document, every screenshot, every piece of evidence I've collected about the woman who calls herself my mother. The woman who destroyed the happiest day of my life is about to have her own special day ruined in the most spectacular way possible. I can feel my heart pounding against my ribs as the wedding march plays, each note bringing me closer to the moment I've been planning for 8 months. 8 months since my wedding was canceled, 8 months since I lost the love of my life, and 8 months since I decided that Patricia Sullivan was going to pay for what she did to me. The irony isn't lost on me that she's getting married in the same church where my wedding was supposed to take place. She specifically chose this venue, this date, even the same florist I had booked. When I confronted her about it, she just laughed that tinkling laugh of hers and said, "Oh, sweetheart, I thought it would be healing for you to see how a real wedding is supposed to look." That's when I knew she hadn't just sabotaged my wedding out of jealousy or control issues. She had done it deliberately, methodically, with the specific intention of taking everything I had worked for and making it hers. She wanted to erase me from this place, from this moment, from this dream I had cherished since I was a little girl. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all started, because understanding my mother requires understanding the intricate web of manipulation she's woven around everyone in her life for decades. Patricia Sullivan, age 54, twice divorced, 3 times engaged, is what therapists would call a covert narcissist. She doesn't rage or scream like the stereotypical narcissistic parent. Instead, she whispers poison with a smile, delivers devastating blows wrapped in concern, and destroys lives while playing the victim so convincingly that even I believed her for most of my 28 years on this earth. Growing up in our colonial house in Westchester County, I learned early that my role in the family was to make my mother look good. Every achievement I had was really her achievement because she was such a wonderful mother. Every failure I had was entirely my fault and a source of deep embarrassment for her. When I got into Harvard, she threw herself a party and told everyone it was because of her sacrifice and dedication. When I struggled with anxiety my freshman year, she told our entire extended family that I was mentally fragile and couldn't handle the pressure she had worked so hard to give me opportunities for. She had this way of taking credit for everything positive in my life while simultaneously making me feel like I was never quite good enough, never quite worthy of the love and support she claimed to give so freely. The pattern became crystal clear when I started dating Michael 3 years ago. Michael Chin, a brilliant software engineer with kind eyes and the most infectious laugh I'd ever heard. He was everything I had ever wanted in a partner: supportive, intelligent, emotionally available, and completely immune to my mother's particular brand of charm. That last part should have been my first warning sign. My mother had always been able to win over every boyfriend I'd brought home with her practiced combination of maternal warmth and subtle flirtation. She would cook their favorite meals, ask about their work with breathless interest, and somehow make them feel like they were the most fascinating men she'd ever met. But Michael saw right through it. He was polite, respectful, but never gave her the adoration she craved. And that's when I should have known she would never let me marry him. The first red flag came during our first Thanksgiving together as a couple. I had been so excited to have Michael meet my extended family, to show him off, to finally have someone by my side who made me feel confident and loved. My mother had insisted on hosting at her house, as she always did, claiming that her dining room table was the only one big enough for the whole family. She spent weeks planning the menu, decorating the house, and making sure everything would be absolutely perfect. But the moment Michael walked through the door, I could see the calculation in her eyes. She hugged him just a little too long, complimented his shirt just a little too enthusiastically, and then spent the entire evening trying to monopolize his attention while subtly undermining me at every turn. Every time I tried to contribute to a conversation, she would interrupt with a corrected version of whatever story I was telling. When I mentioned getting a promotion at the marketing firm where I worked, she quickly added that it was probably because my boss felt sorry for me after my little breakdown the previous year. When Michael complimented the cranberry sauce I had made, she laughed and said, "Oh, that old recipe. I've been trying to get Sarah to add more orange zest for years, but she never listens to suggestions." Each comment was delivered with such sweetness, such maternal concern, that anyone listening would think she was just being helpful. But I could see the confusion growing in Michael's eyes as the evening wore on, the way he started looking at me differently, wondering what other little breakdowns and failures I had hidden from him. The manipulation escalated over the next 2 years, but it was so subtle, so expertly crafted, that I barely noticed it happening. She would call Michael directly to check in, and somehow the conversations always turned to her concerns about my mental health, my spending habits, my ability to handle stress. She would send him articles about depression and anxiety, claiming she was just worried about me and thought he should be aware of my family history of instability. She started inviting him to lunch without me, ostensibly to plan surprises for my birthday or Christmas, but I later learned these meetings were really therapy sessions where she painted herself as the long-suffering mother trying to help her troubled daughter. She was so convincing, so seemingly caring, that Michael started coming home from these encounters with gentle suggestions about therapy, about maybe taking things slower in our relationship, about whether I was really ready for the kind of commitment marriage required. The gaslighting reached its peak when Michael proposed on Christmas Eve 2 years into our relationship. We were sitting by the fireplace in his apartment, snow falling outside the windows, and he got down on one knee with the most beautiful vintage ring I'd ever seen. For exactly 24 hours, I was the happiest woman alive. I called my mother immediately after saying yes, practically screaming with joy into the phone, expecting her to share in my excitement. Instead, there was this long pause, followed by a very controlled, "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I just hope you're sure about this. Marriage is such a big step, and with your anxiety issues." She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke. Even in my moment of pure joy, she managed to plant seeds of doubt, to make me question whether I deserved this happiness, whether I was mentally stable enough to be someone's wife. But the real campaign of destruction began the moment we started planning the wedding. My mother insisted on being involved in every decision, claiming that since she was paying for half of it, she deserved equal say in how her money was spent. At first, I was grateful for her financial contribution and her apparent enthusiasm for helping. She seemed so excited, so invested in making our day perfect. She came to every venue tour, every cake tasting, every dress appointment. She took notes, asked detailed questions, and seemed genuinely thrilled to be part of the process. But slowly, systematically, she began undermining every choice I made while positioning herself as the reasonable one, the one with good taste, the one who really understood what a proper wedding should look like. When I fell in love with the rustic barn venue in the Hudson Valley, she spent weeks finding problems with it. The parking wasn't adequate, The catering kitchen was too small, the acoustics were terrible for the vows, and what would Aunt Margaret think about having to drive so far from the city? She presented alternative venues, all elegant hotel ballrooms and country clubs that felt sterile and impersonal to me, but which she described as classic and timeless. When I chose a local farm-to-table caterer whose food I absolutely loved, she worried aloud about food safety, about whether they could handle our guest count, about what would happen if someone got sick from amateur cooking. She researched the company's health department ratings, found one minor violation from 3 years prior, and presented it to Michael as evidence that I wasn't thinking clearly about our guests' well-being. Every suggestion I made was met with concern, every vendor I loved was somehow inadequate, and every decision became a battle where I had to defend my choices against her helpful criticism. The dress shopping was where I should have drawn the line, but I was so worn down by months of fighting that I just wanted peace. My grandmother had left me her 1952 wedding dress, a stunning ivory silk gown with delicate pearl beading that had been carefully preserved for decades. It was the one thing about my wedding that felt truly mine, truly special, connecting me to the strong women in my family who had come before me. When I tried it on for the first time, I cried. It fit perfectly, needed only minor alterations, and made me feel like a princess. But my mother took one look at me in that dress, and her face fell. "Oh, honey," she said, shaking her head with that practiced look of concern, "it's just so dated. And that color isn't really white, is it? It's more of a yellowy cream. People will think we couldn't afford a proper wedding dress." She suggested we go shopping for something more appropriate, something that would photograph better, something that wouldn't embarrass the family. But this time, I fought back. This time, I stood my ground and told her that I was wearing my grandmother's dress, period. For the first time in months, I felt strong, connected to something bigger than her need to control every aspect of my life. The look that crossed her face in that moment should have terrified me. It was pure rage, barely concealed behind her practiced smile, and I realized that I had just declared war on someone who had been perfecting psychological warfare for decades. She didn't argue with me that day. She just smiled sweetly and said, "Of course, sweetheart. It's your day. I just want you to be happy." But I could see the wheels turning in her head, the way she was already plotting her next move. The final month before the wedding was when everything accelerated into complete chaos. My mother suddenly became incredibly helpful, almost frantic in her desire to make sure every detail was perfect. She volunteered to handle the final fittings for my dress, to coordinate with the caterer about last-minute guest count changes, to confirm details with the photographer and the band. I was so grateful for her help, so relieved that she seemed to have finally accepted my choices, that I didn't question why she was suddenly so eager to take control of all the vendor communications. I was working 60-hour weeks trying to wrap up projects before my honeymoon, and having her handle the wedding logistics felt like a blessing. I should have known that Patricia Sullivan never did anything out of pure kindness. 3 weeks before the wedding, I started noticing that Michael was acting strange. He was distant, distracted, and seemed to be avoiding conversations about our future together. When I asked him what was wrong, he would just say he was stressed about work, about the wedding, about whether we were rushing into things too quickly. He started working late more often, spending less time at my apartment, and when we were together, he seemed to be studying me like he was seeing me for the first time. I chalked it up to pre-wedding jitters, the normal anxiety that comes with making such a huge life commitment. I had no idea that my mother had been calling him daily, feeding him a steady diet of concerns about my mental health, my family's financial problems, and her growing worry that I wasn't mature enough for marriage. The breaking point came exactly 1 week before our wedding day. I was at work, frantically trying to finish a presentation for a client meeting when Michael called me in the middle of the afternoon. His voice was shaky, uncertain, and he asked if we could meet for coffee after work because he needed to talk to me about something important. The tone of his voice made my stomach drop, but I convinced myself it was probably just last-minute venue details or something equally mundane. When I walked into our usual coffee shop that evening and saw him sitting at our favorite corner table with his hands folded, his face pale and serious, I knew my life was about to change forever. He looked up at me with those kind eyes I had fallen in love with, now filled with confusion and doubt, and said the words that would haunt me for months. "Sarah, I think we need to postpone the wedding. I'm not sure you're ready for this, and I'm not sure I am either." The conversation that followed was like being slowly torn apart. Michael explained that he had been having doubts for weeks, that my mother had shared some concerning things about my mental health history, about incidents from my past that I had apparently hidden from him. He mentioned the breakdown I'd had in college, which was actually just a panic attack during finals week that I had handled with counseling and medication. He brought up my supposedly erratic spending habits, which my mother had fabricated by showing him credit card statements from when I had helped her pay for emergency home repairs the previous year. He questioned whether I was emotionally stable enough to handle the stress of marriage, whether I had been honest with him about my family's financial situation, and whether our relationship was built on the foundation of truth and trust that marriage required. Every concern he raised was something my mother had planted. Every doubt he expressed was a seed she had carefully watered and nurtured until it grew into something that could destroy us. I tried to defend myself, to explain the truth behind every twisted story she had told him, but the damage was already done. Michael looked at me like I was a stranger, like the woman he had fallen in love with had been an elaborate fiction. The most devastating part was that he genuinely believed he was doing the right thing, that he was protecting both of us from making a terrible mistake. My mother had convinced him that postponing the wedding was an act of love, a chance for us to work through these issues before making such a permanent commitment. When I begged him to talk to my therapist to get a second opinion about my mental health, he said that my mother had already suggested that, but she was concerned that my therapist might not be objective since I had been manipulating the sessions by not being completely honest about my symptoms. The wedding was supposed to happen in 6 days. 6 days to cancel a reception for 150 people, to notify vendors, to deal with non-refundable deposits, and to somehow explain to our families and friends why the wedding they had been looking forward to for months was suddenly not happening. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that my mother had somehow anticipated this outcome and had already started making calls. When I got home from that devastating coffee shop conversation, she was waiting in my apartment with a cup of tea and that same practiced look of maternal concern. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, pulling me into a hug that felt like a spider's web. "Michael called me. I'm so sorry this is happening, but maybe it's for the best. Maybe this is the universe's way of protecting you from making a mistake." The next 72 hours were the darkest of my life. I barely slept, barely ate, and spent most of my time fielding phone calls from confused relatives and friends who had received my mother's version of events before I could tell them what had really happened. According to her carefully crafted narrative, I had been having second thoughts about the marriage for weeks, that she had been counseling me through my doubts, and that the postponement was really my idea because I wasn't emotionally ready for such a big commitment. She had somehow turned herself into the supportive mother, helping her troubled daughter through a difficult decision, while simultaneously painting me as unstable and indecisive. Every person I talked to offered the same sympathetic response. "Your mother is such a saint for being so understanding about all this." But it was what happened to my grandmother's dress that finally opened my eyes to the true depth of my mother's cruelty. 2 days after the wedding was canceled, I went to pick up the dress from the alterations shop, thinking that at least I could preserve it for some possible future wedding. When I arrived, The seamstress looked confused and told me that my mother had already picked up the dress the day before. I called my mother immediately, asking why she had taken my dress without asking, and she explained that she thought it would be too painful for me to see it right now, that she was just trying to protect me from unnecessary emotional triggers. She promised to bring it by later that week when I was feeling stronger. When she finally brought the dress to my apartment, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The box felt too light, and when I opened it, I found my grandmother's beautiful 1952 gown completely destroyed. The silk was torn in multiple places, the pearl beading was scattered and broken, and there were dark stains across the bodice that looked suspiciously like red wine. My mother gasped in horror, her hand flying to her mouth in what appeared to be genuine shock. "Oh my God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. There must have been an accident at the dry cleaners. I told them to be extra careful with vintage fabric, but you know how these discount places can be." But I knew the truth. I knew she had destroyed my dress deliberately, systematically, as the final act of sabotage in her campaign to ruin not just my wedding, but any connection I had to the strong women in my family who had worn this dress before me. That night, sitting on my bedroom floor surrounded by the ruins of my grandmother's dress, something inside me finally snapped into place. For 28 years, I had made excuses for my mother's behavior, had convinced myself that her cruelty came from love, that her manipulation was just her way of trying to protect me. But destroying that dress wasn't protection. It wasn't even punishment. It was pure, calculated evil designed to break my spirit completely. As I held the torn silk in my hands, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out exactly who Patricia Sullivan really was, and I was going to make her pay for every lie she had told, every life she had damaged, and every dream she had destroyed. The investigation took me 8 months. 8 months of hiring a private investigator, of going through old family documents, of reaching out to her previous husbands and former friends who had mysteriously disappeared from her life over the years. What I discovered was worse than I had ever imagined. My mother wasn't just a narcissist. She was a serial destroyer of relationships, a woman who had been systematically ruining lives for decades. Her first husband, my biological father who I barely remembered, hadn't abandoned us when I was 5 like she had always claimed. She had driven him away with false accusations of abuse, had convinced a family court judge that he was dangerous, and had successfully gotten a restraining order that prevented him from seeing me for over 20 years. Her second husband had lost his job, his house, and his relationship with his own children because of her manipulations. The pattern was always the same. She would insert herself into someone's life, gain their trust, then slowly destroy everything they cared about while positioning herself as the victim. But the most shocking discovery came when I found out about Richard Morrison, the man she was planning to marry in just 2 weeks. Richard was a successful real estate developer, recently widowed, with 2 adult children and 4 grandchildren who adored him. He was kind, generous, and completely unaware that the woman he had fallen in love with had spent the last year systematically researching his finances, his family relationships, and his vulnerabilities. I found emails on her computer that detailed her plans to isolate him from his children, to convince him to change his will in her favor, and to gradually take control of his real estate empire. She wasn't marrying Richard because she loved him. She was marrying him because she saw him as her retirement plan, her final big score after a lifetime of destroying other people's happiness. That's when I realized that standing up at her wedding wasn't just about revenge. It was about saving Richard and his family from the same destruction she had brought to everyone else who had ever loved her. It was about finally telling the truth about Patricia Sullivan, about exposing the carefully constructed lies that had allowed her to move from victim to victim for decades. And it was about getting justice for my father, for her previous husbands, for Michael, and for the scared little girl I had been who spent years believing that her mother's cruelty was somehow her own fault. So here I am, standing in the back of St. Mary's Cathedral, watching the woman who destroyed my life walk toward what she thinks will be her greatest triumph. But in just a few minutes, when the priest asks if anyone has any reason why these two should not be wed, I'm going to stand up with my manila envelope full of evidence and give Patricia Sullivan the wedding gift she truly deserves, the truth. Because after 28 years of her lies, manipulations, and psychological warfare, the world is finally going to see exactly who my mother really is. And this time, her perfect smile won't be enough to save her.